I'm recording Malcolm Bass speaking about Penyghent with Ulster in the 1980s and 90s. So how did you first get involved with Ulster then, Malcolm?
Well, I'd done some climbing at school and hill walking at school. When I first went to Leeds, I went to Leeds University, and I spent the first year of my time at university just drinking, not working very much, socialising, and really sort of not getting in a very good physical state. And I was just missing going to the hills, doing things in the outdoors. And so in the second year, myself and my my best friend at university at the time, Javed Bharti, and I joined Ulster for a couple of reasons, really. Firstly, my dad had been really into caving when he was a young lad driving up from London from King's College, and I'd seen lots of his pictures, black and white pictures of caving. It just completely fascinated me. Javed was going out with a girl called Louise Holden, who he's now married to. They've been married for many, many years. But Louise's dad was Bill Holden, who was a big member of the NPC. I think it was the NPC. Yeah, it was the NPC back. I'm not going to get the years right now, but the generation before us. So Louise had got an interest in caving, and Louise joined up with us as well. So the three of us all joined Ulster. And within weeks, I was just completely captivated. First caving trips were brilliantly exciting. Loved the whole scene of waiting for the bus on Otley Road, the minibus, all getting picked up. Sort of like 24. It was a huge journey. So we would leave Leeds at about 9 o'clock and maybe get underground by about 2 o'clock after all kinds of chaos on the way up, and a stop for breakfast, and eventually deciding what cave we were going to go down. But that whole thing was brilliant. And that's how I got involved. And once I got involved, I was caving every week, sometimes twice a week for the next couple of decades, really, or the next decade at least.
So how do you get involved in the Penyghent extensions then?
Ooh, not as quickly as I would have liked, because at the time the first Penyghent extensions happened, the passing of Psycho Crawl by John Watt, I was still sort of quite junior in the club, and so there was this group of people who were a bit older than me and more experienced cavers, people like John Watt and Andy Tharrett, John Belshaw, John Cooper, that kind of group of people, and they were the kind of people we were looking to teach us, help us along. We were sort of like their apprentices at that stage. But I was massively, massively keen. And the whole club at the time was imbued by the ethos of the Brooke brothers and all the great explorations that had happened in the 70s. So that the memories of things like Langcliffe and Mossdale and Far Country were all really there in the club culture, and so we all knew that to be a proper Ulster caver, what you ultimately had to do was to find new passage, and it seemed really hard to do, and we were those of us who were keen were absolutely desperate to do this, and Watty and his group of people, they'd got really fit by just caving and caving and caving, and so they'd got to a stage where they'd get to the bottom of decent potholes, and there'd been a state to look around, to spend some time kind of sniffing out leads and looking at loose ends and that kind of thing. And they'd actually started this semi-formal project of checking out any places where there was a discrepancy between guidebook descriptions and the Ulster journals, or any places where it wasn't absolutely clear what the end was. And what happened across Erie Pot was one of those things. I can't remember the exact details, but the account that had been written either in the logbook or the explorations journal was just very slightly different from what it actually said in the guidebook in Northern Caves, and it was those kind of things that they would spot and go after. So the first I knew of the passing of Psycho Crawl and the opening of the whole of that bit was I walked into one of the many squalid houses that the cavers lived in round Leeds 6, and on a blackboard there was a bit of, in the kind of kitchen, there was a bit of what was obviously a survey drawn up on the blackboard, and I can't remember whose house it was, but I walked in and there was a definite move to obscure the survey, to rub it out, not to tell me what it was about, and I asked, you know, what's that? What's that a survey of? I don't recognise that. Where's that? Nobody would tell me. And clearly there was a trip being organised to somewhere, sometime. I didn't have the exact details. But I think, and I'm fairly sure what that was about, that would have been after Watty had passed the Psycho Crawl on the Saturday or at the weekend, and this was a follow-up trip being planned to go into the open passage beyond. But I wasn't in that in-group at the time, so I remember being, you know, really frustrated. I really wanted to be part of it all, but there's always limits imposed on the follow-up teams when open passage goes. So that would have been the trip that got through the Crawl of Cthulhu and descended Jason's pitch and got to the sump, basically. The Friday the 13th Part 1 sump. And then the next trip after that would be when Julian Griffiths dived that sump to get through to Friday the 13th Part 2. And then once all the mainstream excitement and the main line of the thing had been explored and surveyed, the rest of us got a chance to pick up the leavings, basically. And that's when I got involved. And so the first thing I was involved in down there was taking scaling poles through the sump at the end of Friday the 13th to try and get into the avens between Friday the 13th, between the two sumps. Yeah, and that was really exciting caving, because it got a free dive, you know, to get through to get through to Friday the 13th Part 2, carrying the scaling poles, scaling up there. For a young caver, it really felt like I was actually doing proper cave exploration. That didn't go anywhere, but the bit that was left over was the highway to hell. I can't remember the exact dates, but the exploration of the highway to hell took, I think, probably a couple of years really to get completed, because it's just such a remorseless passage.
In what respect?
It's low, it's full of cobbles that kind of jam up underneath you. It's wet. You've already gone through one long low wet crawl to get through Psycho Crawl, and it had a couple of bits that needed a little bit of digging out. So the foot originally stopped at this low bit called the Kidney Crusher that Watty and I passed, and I think once having passed that, the next bit was a really tight sort of eye of a needle squeeze in the bedrock, which Watty stripped his wetsuit jacket off to get through, and he got through that to get through into the passage on the other side, which would later go to Gloom Doom Passage, and we eventually hammered that with a lump hammer so you could get through without taking your wetsuit jacket off, and then that went to a big duck which Andy Tharrott passed on a solo trip called Gloom Doom Passage. Very long, gloopy, low airspace passage. And Andy past that and came to a little Avon at the end of that. And that was regarded as there's no passage going underneath at the bottom of the Avon. That was regarded as the end of that. We always thought the highway to hell was an inlet. But it was there was a real culture in the club at the time of just pushing every single little crawl a little bit to its absolute limit. It felt like it would be sort of shaming to leave the extension without all the leads pushed to their absolute conclusion. And because finding passage was what we were trying to do, we would just push them all to their conclusions. And so this Avon at the end of Gloom Doom Passage rankled, and it was still there to get done. And me and Adrian Meller, who I was doing a lot of caving with at the time, he and I went to climb this Avon at the end of Gloom Doom Passage. We thought it wouldn't need climbing gear, because Andy said it was quite a narrow Avon. We thought we'd just sort of like bridge or thrutch our way up it one way or the other. And we forced our way all the way up through the highway to hell, exhale sufficiently to squeeze through the dialysis machine, and then into the deep water of Gloom Doom Passage, and glooped along there. I mean, that is such a long, deep duck that whenever you go along there, you just can't help thinking about what the rain might be doing outside, because you just know if the water level rose just a tiny bit, you'd be done for. So it's a very sort of evocative bit of passage. We eventually got to the end of that, frozen stupid, just because we were just wearing sort of 4mm wetsuits, tatty 4mm wetsuits, and you're in water with only your head out for 100 or 200 metres. It's a long way, and you're not moving vigorously enough to keep warm. It's quite floaty. In fact, the easiest way to move along it is just to sort of float. And we got to this Avon type feature, which didn't look very compelling to climb at all, but it was clear that there was a passage out the other side of it, which just needed a few boulders rolling aside. So we moved rolled aside those boulders, and there was more grotty, crawling passage out the other side, which we followed, until suddenly, wonder of wonders, we just crawled across this shingle bank, and we were in this great big, wide, low, but very wide, much more major passage with we're at a T-junction, had both a left and a right way to go, and we were just absolutely staggered by this, because we thought we were following an inlet. We had no idea why there'd be a big passage like that, and we'd sort of gone intent on maybe at best coming back with, I don't know, 50 metres of squatted crawling passage to add to the survey, and just intersecting this thing was just brilliant.
So what was that called then?
That's what's now called Relief Junction. Okay. And so we had a big passage going left and a big passage going right. And I spoke to Adrian earlier this evening. When we got there, we started singing. We started singing a Bros song, so if you remember Bros, and the song was "When will I be famous?" That sort of captured the mixture of. There was half of us. We were still young enough to think that by discovering cave passage in Yorkshire, we would actually become, rich, famous, sexually alluring to the opposite sex. So all of those things, we really thought that would happen. But on the other hand, we were knowing enough to know that was just completely ridiculous. So singing the song was half in hope that we actually would become famous, but half knowing that was complete rubbish, and that only a few cavers around the world would ever care. But it was a great moment anyway. Relief Junction. But we were pretty short of light by that time.
Was it on carbide then?
On carbide, yeah. We didn't have much carbide with us, and it had taken us quite a long time to get down to that point, and we had to get back out. So we said we'll just have to limit this. So we went right for a way. The passage was still going, and that's the way that eventually connects back to the collapses near the end of the Hunt Pot Inlet.
Yeah.
The place where we hoped eventually to make a connection, but never did.
It's still not gone either.
Is it still people still trying?
I think Sam Armstrong tried a while back, but
right.
No success.
It's a massive. There were some monstrous collapses in there. We were trying to dig it. It felt like the rift was collapsing all the way back to the surface. I don't know where the rock was coming from. It's just enormous amounts were coming back, dropping down into that.
A useful shortcut if it does break through.
And I think we'll maybe come on to this later, but having been, it's a massive shortcut, and you can hear. Actually, before I think it was probably at its closest before we started digging it. I think all the digging we did made it worse. But I remember the first time when Andy Tharrott and Paul Monaco were at the right side, the Hunt Pot Inlet side of it, and I can't remember who was at. I think it was me and Adrian again, and Hogan and Madeline Price were at the wrong side of it, and he could just chat like I'm chatting to you through it. It really felt very, very close, and we were just so frustrated. We couldn't see how we couldn't find a way through it. We couldn't actually make anything physically connect. But we were all keen smokers at the time. A lot of us were keen smokers, ridiculously. And Andy and Paul were like top smokers, really. And they were just sat in the Hunt Pot Inlet smoking. And A, we wanted the cigarettes, but B, the lovely smell of the cigarettes was wafting through to us. And then what we were going to do on the wrong side of it was to go and dive the sump at the end of Too Long Gone. So we knew we had a lot more work to do.
Yeah.
I don't know, it was 7 o'clock in the evening or something by that time. And Andy and Paul said, right, we're off to the pub. And it was that, they were so envious. And it would be so good if that had gone, but it didn't. Anyway, back to the trip with Adrian. The first trip when we broke through, we went downstream, what turned out to be downstream, for a little way, till we got to a big avon with flowstone dropping down it, which was called Acid Avon.
Is that reminiscent on your partying days?
Sorry?
Is that reminiscent?
Yeah. What we would have liked to have been our partying days, I suppose. But it's just in the acid house era, and that was the kind of music we were playing on the car stereos on the way up. And oddly, it seemed to kind of fit with these, the idea of these all-night raves that people were having with music and sort of altering their states by taking drugs and dancing all night. Oddly, didn't feel a million miles away. There's a sort of strange similarity between being underground all night in Penyghent and altering your states through tiredness, exhaustion, but also moments of elation, I think, in both. So Acid Avon, Adrian and I decided, although it was really frustrating to go out at that point, we'd have loved to have kept exploring. We just had to turn round to get back out in the light. Not in the light, get back out with the amount of light we had. And it was such a long grind back out. Because when you're exploring new stuff, the adrenaline keeps you going, and you're always wanting to look round the next corner, and you almost lose track of, I've got to go all the way back through all of this, all the way back through Gloomdom, all the way back through the highway to hell, drag ourselves back up all the pitches, and we got out, and it had snowed while we were underground. Wow. And I remember in our tattered, and our wetsuits by then were absolutely trashed by that trip. Sort of bum sliding down the side of Penyghent in the snow, with frozen bits of naked flesh sticking out. And it was a Pennine Hut occasion, so we then went to the Pennine Hut that evening. But I think I think we weren't telling anybody that night. I think we were keeping it to ourselves until we organised a sort of odd... the way the cycle goes round, I was not on the first follow-up trip. I think I was closely guarding who was going to come on the next follow-up trip. Yes.
So what sort of stuff were you wearing in the extensions then?
Well, on that first trip we weren't properly equipped. Just the ordinary standard 4mm caving wetsuit.
Yeah.
But then we realised if we were really going to do anything, to spend any time in the extensions, we're going to have to gear up a little bit. Especially we're going to try and do surveying and things. So we got hold of Warmback at the time made I think it was a 6.5mm semi-dry diver's wetsuit. It was called a semi-dry. Had really good seals on the wrists and the ankles, and it was a lot thicker anyway. And then instead of wearing a wetsuit hood, there were these sort of short-sleeved, like a wetsuit hood jacket type thing, if you can imagine, like a gilet with a hood on. I can't remember who did those, but they were really good because they were like they had that knee pad material, slightly reinforced stuff on the backs of them. So if you were, for long crawls, if your back was rubbing on the surface, on the roof, it protected them.
That's good.
They were called ninjas because they looked like that wasn't their official name, but that's what we called them.
Yeah, okay.
So the follow-up trip we bought. Some people had those semi-dries for diving anyway, or people bought them to use in the extensions, or people found various ways of basically wearing more than 4mm of neoprene.
So what happened on the next trip then?
The next trip was managed to. I don't think we were that selective in asking people who wanted to come. And always these things, you think that there's more people in the world who actually want to do this than actually will. So I think there was probably about 8 to 10 of us who set off down the cave, and maybe 4 or 5 of us who actually got through all the misery to get back to the end point. So who's that? Me, Adrian, Mella, Javed Bharti, who I've mentioned earlier, John Bonwick, Andy Tharrott. I think that was probably about all. I better just check this. See who it was. Watty. I forgot Watty, yeah. John Watts, yes. Were the people who came along on the next trip. Yeah, Watty was just such a stalwart for surveying, because he knew that there was open passage at the end, big open passage, and he started his day's proceedings by surveying Gloom Doom Passage. So he started the survey at the point that where the passage that Andy Tharrott had done earlier on his solo trip. So that's where the heavy neoprene really came into its own to try and survey passage like that. And with so I think we sort of fiddled around doing things not on the main line till Watty and the survey caught up, and we all reunited at Acid Avon at some point, having explored various sort of oxbows and alternative routes, not amounting to very much, things like Pill Popper Passage. But then we all gathered under Acid Avon, which was a good point actually, because downstream of there, we were hugely expecting. It was a really big passage for anything we'd found in Penyghent. We had no idea where it was going to go, or why it was there, or what it was. The water in it didn't appear to be active at this point, and wasn't active, the water we were going through, and it had a very distinctive ambience of big, very water-worn black cobbles, very dark cobbles, and static clear water on the floor. Obviously, a place that flooded very severely when it did flood, because there's no sand, no remains anywhere. It just looked like it whooshed out with a lot of power when it did. So we went downstream from Acid Avon. We got into the nicest passage that we found in Penyghent, really, which is the lovely bit of passage which on the front of the Explorations Journal 2.
Who's that on the front?
That's a chap called Andy Backhouse. That's not on the follow-up trip.
Right.
There's some great pictures. The pictures in here were done by Pete Bolt, who's a Mendip caver predominantly, who we got to know through caving in South Wales.
Okay.
But Andy was the main model for Pete during the photographic trip. Yeah. So down into Paradise, which ended all too abruptly, but it's a nice bit of dry, big walking passage. And then the way on from the end of Paradise, and the end of Paradise is odd kind of thing, because the passage is quite straight and then ends at this wall of calcite, basically.
Right.
There's no way on there, but the way on is very much a step down under the left wall into a really wet, wide passage. It's a fantastic bit of passage, actually. It's really unusual. And we called it Paradise Lost because you're immediately into deep water. But getting into deep water presented us all with a problem in that Javed, at the time, couldn't swim. And he was absolutely determined, quite rightly, that he was going to complete the exploration. We were determined that he was going to complete it with us. And it was the sections there on that day that were very much out of depth or just in depth.
Right.
So there's that. Javed was sort of partly towed, pushed, gradually. He had enough neoprene on to make him quite buoyant.
Yeah.
And it was that kind of passage where you can do that sort of thing of like moonwalking, where you touch down on the bottom, bounce yourself forwards and along a little bit, touch down on the bottom, bounce yourself forward and along. And it was really, really weird passage. And it was, thinking about it now, how lucky we were that the passage was so strange. Just the atmospherics of being in we felt really at the back of beyond, because it felt such a remote place to be, and to be in this really strange deep water passage was really, really atmospheric. And we thought that was still static. We were wrong, actually, but we thought that was static. It was so deep and wide you couldn't detect the water flow.
Yep.
And we glooped on down there. I think Watty was still surveying, and Adrian, who had more neoprene than anybody else, was being like a survey boy, really, rather than anything else. He would kind of float while Watty pointed the compass at him. No need for the clinometer there. And Watty, I can still remember Watty sort of trying to hold the survey book and things aloft. Watty was such a assiduous surveyor. He would never. He all done absolutely brilliantly, even in really harsh conditions. And when we closed the loop around the Hunt Pot Inlet, and his degree of accuracy and all that surveying was really impressive.
Wow.
Yeah. And eventually we that passage Paradise Lost glooped along for a while, and then we came to a boulder breakdown, and it seemed to us that at this breakdown a huge powerful stream was appearing out of a side passage under the right wall, and so that was even more exciting. Now it intersected an active streamway. What the hell is this water? There's no... You kind of might have thought, could this be the Hunt Pot Inlet water? And and then followed that downstream through a nice, mostly walking, but slightly more Vados feeling. I don't think it is a fully Vados passage, but it's a more Vados feeling, narrower, squarer passage, which is called Too Long Gone, down to this sump, this out-of-depth sump, which we plovered into, and there was this tube at the other side of it, the sump tube, which is, I don't know, in all my years caving, after that was probably the most talked about bit of passage in the Yorkshire Dales. The sump tube! So multiple generations of Ulster cavers were determined to be the people who eventually passed the sump tube. But I think the riddle of the sump tube's now been solved, hasn't it?
Yes, it's one of Beardy's top 10 Leeds in Dales.
Top 10 Leeds in Dales. And we did actually insert ourselves in the sump tube on that day because the water levels were quite high, so you could just sort of float across the sump and wriggle into the sump tube. And I think about it now, we probably made better progress that day than many subsequent times because the water was slightly lapping into the sump tube, so the clayey mud was a little bit more... what's the opposite of friction? Lubrication. Yes, a little bit more lubrication to wriggle a bit further down it. And that was the end of that trip. I don't think we... Oh no, we did. 'Cause when we knew we weren't going to get any further there. We went back upstream to where we thought the water was coming in, what we thought the inlet was, and I forced my way up there. But I was quite spooked by that, actually, because it was too much water in too low a passage. There was a lot of water coming down it. And I was a bit worried about finding my way back accurately, getting the best way back.
Yeah.
And the water slightly piling up against my face. I didn't like it. So we backed off that. And then dragged ourselves out. But pretty exultant, really, after finding all that sort of passage, and asking ourselves the question, what on earth is going on down there? I can't think of the Hunt Pot Inlet, as I understand it, basically just dried up one day, didn't it? In the past. How that happened, I've no idea, and it seems highly likely that water at the back end of the Living Dead extensions is the Hunt Pot Inlet water. Well, I mean, it almost certainly is the Hunt Pot Inlet water. But what on earth must have happened in the cave to cause it to stop going one way?
It's strange, isn't it?
And completely go another way. And I don't think you get many events like that sort of in the span of human life. It seems like something ought to happen in geological time. But I can't imagine how it kind of... Because you wouldn't think a collapse would do it. Could totally seal it.
Strange, isn't it?
The only thing I can think of is just finally dissolve something away and cut through.
Possibly, yeah.
So I don't think Hunt Pot Inlet takes water even in heavy floods anymore. Trying to remember now because I've been there in heavy floods. But I don't think there was water coming out of Hunt Pot Inlet when we got stuck in there. When we got stuck in there through flooding, when we went out the main passage, I don't think there was water coming out of the Hunt Pot Inlet. Can't completely remember.
So did you go another trip after that then?
Oh, there were trips for multiple trips to try and sort out little bits and pieces. I don't think on that one we even pushed the upstream passage towards the Hunt Pot Inlet.
Okay.
So we did that on a subsequent trip. There was more surveying happened on subsequent trips, and I suppose the 2 or 3 key follow-up trips was the one I was talking about earlier when Monaco and Tharot went down the Hunt Pot Inlet, and we went up the into the Living Dead extensions to try and make that connection, and we spent 4 or 5 hours trying to dig towards each other.
No success.
No success. And then on that trip, so we all, the rest of us, Madeline Hogan, Keith Hobley, Hogan's proper name, Adrian and I went down to the downstream sump, near the sump tube, and there's a big job to take a couple of cylinders down there. It was a really long day. I can't think why we set ourselves so many objectives on that day. 5 hours digging under, but we did. Maybe hoped we'd get it all done and finished with on that day. And so, Adrian kitted up in this out-of-depth canal, and there's that sort of atmosphere, isn't there, around a cave dive,
Yep.
Especially a remote cave dive. You can feel the divers' excitement and anxiety, and the backup crew are no less anxious, really. And so there was this, this was a new dive, this new passage taking a lot of water. We knew it was perched above Branskill, so a lot could come from it. All really exciting. And Adrian kits up, and his lights, he slowly sinks down into the sump tube, not into the sump tube, into the sump, and lights disappear in the murky water, and off he goes. And you hear that clattering and banging of the tanks going away for a little while. Except this time, we kept on hearing the clattering and banging of the tanks going away for a little while. Didn't stop hearing them. Could hear the exhaust valve bubbling away until you could hear them clattering and banging really loudly. We could hear him, shouted, "Adrian, Adrian, hello!" And so Adrian had thought he'd gloriously passed the sump, but on this occasion it wasn't actually sumped. So we had this conversation, and I was able to follow the diving line through, head pressed against the ceiling, and there was usable airspace all the way through. And we were presented by this wall of boulders at the other side, and not a very big gap as you came out of the sump to the wall of boulders, and you could wriggle up the sort of the boulder slope, and it was clear that it would be diggable at some point. But we were pretty spooked by it, really, with a fear of the boulders rolling back and blocking our way back down the slope and out of the sump. But I know that some Ulster people, was it Sam Elsorn who subsequently...
I think he pushed the tube
right
above the sump with Mike Bottomley, but I'm not sure what else happened.
I think maybe they actually dug that choke and found the other side of the tube from the downstream side.
Okay.
But anyway, the best lead in the Dales, Beardy's best lead in the Dales is now sorted one way or another, and unfortunately that boulder choke, even though they got through into more space, they regarded as a very, very long-term project. We never went back, Adrian and I never went back, because we thought it's not really viable at the other side of this thing, that you could never tell whether you need to take diving kit down there all the way to the end of Too Long Gone to get through. The number of days where that sump would be down sufficiently to float through would be really limited over the course of a year. So there was not really any particular point at trying to dig at it. And to be honest, I think we were quite scared of it in that position. But it's all down there. It's very drafty. There's a lot of water going in, but equally it backs up really badly. You can tell from the passage at Too Long Gone that it backs up really badly. So there's probably something quite insurmountable in there. That's a real shame, because it's perched, I think, maybe 20 metres above Branskill. So there's something to be found in there still. So that was one of the important follow-up trips. The other one was when we eventually Dinny Davis and I worked out. We went to the bit of passage where the water came into Too Long Gone that we'd originally thought on the follow-up trip was actually the inlet. Turned out it wasn't, because we forced our way upstream and discovered that the water, it was just an oxbow from the big Paradise Lost passage. And I don't think anybody's still clear exactly where the water gets into Too Long Gone. And it might not just come in through one place, it might come in through a variety of places. Anyway, we forced our way upstream through that passage where the flow of water had been too fast on the first follow-up trip, and discovered that the water was just coming back in from Paradise Lost, but there was another passage going off a different way, going off to the left, which we followed, and it got really low, tight beddings. But we were wriggling through these low, tight beddings, and you could hear another stream going on, and there was a lot of draft. And there's this really odd area, which in my mind's eye is not really like a passage, but like a big area of low bedding, like a sort of 180 degrees of low bedding. And eventually I managed to worm my way through there and drop off the edge of this bedding into a small hands and knees crawling streamway, which we called interdiction streamway. To interdict something is to forbid somebody to go there. And it felt like this passage was, you just weren't supposed to be there. It was in such a place. It seemed so obscure. But of course it offered another opportunity to try and get downstream. I don't think on that occasion Dinny was able to pass those squeezes. So I followed it downstream to a choke, which was drafting, but again it was just in a completely ridiculous place to dig. And upstream I didn't get very far. And again I think might have been Sam Alshorn, who eventually passed that upstream and discovered that is yet another oxbow. It's not a new streamway. So there's this bizarre situation down there of multiple streams kind of flowing in parallel, one with another, possibly with the same origin, not with separate origins. So that was interdiction streamway, and has now been discovered in the last few years not to be the clue to anything. Although downstream in there might still... It could be possible that digging the downstream choke in that might bypass the choke at the bottom of Too Long Gone streamway and drop into something. And then the last key trip I can think of in the Penyghent thing is the trying to find where the water came into Paradise Lost, the big deep passage, i.e. where the Hunt Port Inlet water came in. And that was, we think it came in through a passage called Cholera Canal, just near Paradise. And eventually I dived that after years after I originally started exploring down there. And it didn't really seem to go anywhere. It just ended in silt banks. So I don't actually think that's where the water comes in. So we're not completely clear where the water comes into Paradise Lost. There's multiple low archways on both sides where the water could come in.